Scott here with another episode of the History Unplugged podcast. For nearly 2 centuries, the beating heart of American electoral politics was on the back of a train. Candidates began touring small towns on railway lines, beginning with Andrew Jackson and William Henry Harrison in the 1830s. The greatest whistle-stop tour in American history was the 1896 presidential campaign of William Jennings Bryan, who spoke 600 times to 5 million people from a train car. This method helped politicians connect with as many voters as possible in the country's largest cities and smallest towns, when for many places the most important building was a train depot. Campaign trains were also the site of Machiavellian scheming. There would be the candidate and his staff on one car, and the press on the other car, with the campaign trying to get its message through the press, and the press trying to divulge as much juicy information from the campaign as possible. Whistle-stop tours were the cornerstone of campaigns for Franklin D. Roosevelt, Harry Truman, Dwight Eisenhower, and well into the 20th century. But with the increase in utilization of air travel for campaigns, whistle-stop tours largely represent a lost age in American politics. Today's guest is Edward Segal, author of Whistle Stop Politics, Campaign Trains and the Reporters Who Covered Them, and we look at what was once the dominant form of campaigning, how it affected American politics, and what we've lost by no longer having this. Hope you enjoy this discussion. America lives in a post-train electoral age, and presidential campaigns seem to move extremely fast or incredibly slow. They move fast when, in the run-up to voting for a presidential campaign, a candidate will be hitting multiple cities, sometimes multiple states in one day. They can also move extremely slow when, say, somebody is in Iowa trying to win the Iowa caucuses. They'll go county to county, town to town. They might be pushing for what's called the full Grassley when they hit all 99 counties of Iowa, named in honor of Senator Chuck Grassley. Let's go back to an earlier age when trains dominated U.S. politics, which they did for about 180 years, at the origins of the train electoral age. Can you tell me about the growth of trains in the United States and how they were married with electoral politics?
The history of campaign trains in American politics really parallels that of the growth of the railroads in the United States. In 1836, there was a presidential candidate that did probably consider the first campaign train, but it was really limited just for a few miles, and it was kind of like testing out the concept. Over time, the more train tracks there were, the more candidates felt comfortable campaigning by train, and as the train track connected more towns and cities and villages and other communities across the country, politicians took advantages of the growth of the trains to help connect and use the trains to connect with voters and other members of the public.
The first whistle-stop tours or train tours for politicians happened in the 1830s with President William Henry Harrison. And electoral politics on trains and whistle-stop tours, I thought about this and realized they don't happen to the same extent in Europe, even though Europe has a more sophisticated train network at this time. And part of that has to do with the United States, with the way that trains would travel, with whistle stops, and what made it particularly advantageous to travel by trains for politicians, and you could hit up multiple towns in a way. But first, can you tell me about the early examples of politicking by train, and what was it about whistle stops that made trains such a good means of transportation for politicians?
Yeah, William Jennings Bryan is really credited as perfecting and inventing what we consider to be the modern-day whistle-stop campaign train tour, and he did that when he ran for president in 1896. And I know what it's like to campaign by train because I actually organized a campaign train tour for a member of Congress in Oklahoma. And there is nothing like a train coming into the station, whether it was an old steam locomotive or the modern diesels. You know, the piece of machinery weighing several tons slowly entering the station, it's quite a sight and makes quite an impression. And many times the candidates arranged to have marching bands or cheerleaders greeting the train. I recall the story that when Lyndon Baines Johnson ran for vice president in 1860, when his train would pull into the station, he would have a song, The Yellow Rose of Texas, blaring from the public address system as the train entered the station to help rile up the crowds. So there's nothing like a campaign train and the entrance of the train into the station to get people interested and excited and create the kind of atmosphere and excitement that I think is really lacking in a lot of campaign events today.
Yeah, can you describe those early campaigns that make full use of the train? Because Stephen Douglas is mentioned in your book, who ran against Abraham Lincoln, and then we jump forward several decades to William Jennings Bryan in 1896. But for much of the 19th century, it was considered beneath the dignity of the office of the president for a candidate to campaign on his own. Now, of course, he campaigned. He had surrogates who were speaking on his behalf. He had hatchet men who were trying to destroy other candidates, in ways that I think make today's modern politics much less shocking if you see what they were saying about each other back then, easily all the way back to Jefferson and Adams. So can you talk about the lead up to and then let's say the Big Bang moment of electoral train politics with William Jennings Bryan?
As you said, for decades after Harrison in 1836, it was considered a poor form for candidates to actively pursue the office of the presidency. The office was supposed to go after the man. They were all men at that time. The man was not supposed to go after the office. So that's why it was unusual for Stephen Douglas to campaign by train. And he really made an impression. He had two semi-military men on a flat car, and as the train would enter a community, they would fire off a cannon to get people's attention. And that was certainly a great way to make an entrance into a town or a community. But it was William Jennings Bryan who, 1896, really broke with tradition, and he traveled thousands and thousands of miles across the country, gave hundreds and hundreds of speeches, connected with hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of people around the country, many of whom had never seen a presidential candidate. And his speeches to little towns and communities would last a few minutes, and then they would go on to the next community. And it was a great way not of just of connecting with people, but of generating publicity. And that was another benefit of campaigning by train. Local newspapers would not only report what the candidate said, but would often publicize their schedules ahead of time so people knew when and where the candidate would arrive. And that continues to be a benefit of campaign train into the 20th and even into the 21st century as a great way to get people's attention. And I call it the eye candy. Even though today the trains are not used as widely as before, they certainly make a good photo op and is an excellent way to get people's attention and for the candidate to deliver their message to the people.
There really is a lost age of politics when campaigning by train, giving speeches, was considered gauche, when now in the 21st century, most candidates will appear on late night programs doing cameos, or they show up to the Iowa State Fair and eat disgusting pieces of stick meat for the pleasure of fair-going onlookers. So if you go on Google Images, you can find pictures of Bernie Sanders or Mitt Romney or anyone you could possibly think of eating pieces of fried Iowa State Fair stick meat food, if you want to call it food. Looking back at what an actual stop was like, not only what the stop was like, but who were on the particular trains, can you give me a composite picture of a whistle stop tour, the candidate car, the staffer car, the press car? Who was on this train and what happened when it stopped into a town?
In the 20th century, the campaign trains were often 15 or even 20 cars in length. It was a great configuration, and the size of the train really depended on how many people were traveling with the candidate. Sometimes there were dozens or hundreds of people on the train, which would include members of the candidate's staff, family members, and dozens or sometimes hundreds of reporters who were there to cover the statements and activities of the candidate. The candidate's car was usually second to the last or sometimes the last car on the train. Why? Because there was a back platform on the train, and at each depot stop, the candidate would go out and talk to the people. Afterwards, go back into the car, and the train would leave for the next stop. The press car was usually in the middle of the campaign train, and these were press cars, sometimes one or two, depending upon the number of reporters who were traveling with the candidate. But the typical scenario of a campaign train is you would slowly enter the station, and then perhaps there was a band to play a few songs to rile up the crowd and get them excited. Often a local dignitary or a VIP, such as a member of Congress or the local mayor or other popular local public officials, would come out on the rear platform of the train, praise the candidate, and make the introduction. Sometimes before the candidate came out, other local officials would take advantage of the crowd and give brief remarks or also praise the candidate. And then the candidate would come out and give a speech of anywhere between 5 and 10 or maybe 20 minutes. These were tightly scripted events, usually, and they also would have a very tight schedule, so they really did not have a lot of time to spend at each station. Depending upon who was also traveling with the candidate would introduce members of his staff, or as in the case of President Truman when he was campaigning in 1948, he would introduce his wife and his daughter, who often traveled with him. And sometimes the spouse or the family members of the candidate were more popular than the candidate, and they would often get a bigger, rousing round of applause than the candidate. But the candidates would take advantage of the people who were with them, whether it was the VIPs, the local dignitaries, or members of their family, to help put a human touch to their candidacies and to help establish and take advantage of rapport with the crowd.
Let's look at the individual campaigns, starting with Teddy Roosevelt. And as I found on the show, everything starts with Teddy Roosevelt. His 1903 tour of the Western states, he blasts through them on this whirlwind tour, travels with John Muir. The seeds are planted for the U.S. National Park System. So there's all sorts of important implications. But could you mention what comes out of this whistle-stop tour?
He took that tour and others to help build his public support for the environment. And he was cutting edge then. As you said, he helped establish the National Park System, and he went around the country. It was unusual because he did not want it to be a political tour. He would talk to Democratic crowds, Republican crowds. He would meet with Democratic officials and Republican officials, but he was more interested in promoting the environment and his other legislative priorities. And he really took advantage of that to build understanding and sympathy and support for what he wanted to do with the environment. But it doesn't mean he did not occasionally on that tour or others run into some heckling or some people who did not agree with his policies. But he was a good sport about it. He would take advantage of the crowd. Sometimes he would fight back or criticize the people who were heckling him. But overall, I think it was set the tone for what later to be advocacy programs, because he used that campaign train to help build support for a program and not his candidacy or his presidency.
Jumping forward to the next Roosevelt, FDR, something that surprised me that you mentioned in your book is that when he was doing a whistle-stop campaign, it energized him so much that his advisors told him he needed to slow down. He couldn't keep doing 18-hour days like this, but he didn't listen to them and he kept pushing forward, which, although I should know better, I always think of FDR as this patrician blue blood who tolerated speaking to the common man, although he didn't really like it, but that's more of a projection onto him than who he really was. So tell me about his use of train campaigning and what it was like for him to reach out to the public.
Many people don't realize it, and I write about this in the book, that he actually campaigned extensively by train in 1920 when he was on the ticket as vice president. And he really had a lot of fun. He really found a way to connect with people. And his advisors were really impressed on how well he did and how he had, to large part, having polio, he developed a tremendous amount of empathy and understanding of the people. And that empathy and understanding really shined through in his speeches and his connections with the people. And it was that 1920 campaign tour across the country that really helped set the stage for when he ran for president in 1932. And you're right, many of his advisors, because of his health, they didn't think he was up for it. In fact, they wanted to have a doctor accompany him on the campaign train to look out for his health, and he wouldn't have any of it. He refused to take the doctor with him, and he refused to listen to his advisors, and he insisted on going on that campaign train, and it was very successful. It helped set the stage for his victory, and he campaigned by train as president or running for re-election for president many times in the years that came.
Campaigning by train, it's not the sole way that one campaigns. It's part of an overall strategy. And you know this well. You are a campaign manager, a press secretary, and the word campaign comes from a military campaign where you're utilizing multiple forms of attack to go after an enemy, combined air assaults, combined arms, going by air, by land, by sea. And you can think of a train in a similar way, that it's one form of attack against an opponent. And it doesn't remain static either. The way that one would campaign by train in 1896 is very different from the 1950s or 1960s. How does the tactic of a whistle-stop tour evolve over time? And what are the pros and cons of campaigning by train? Because it can't do everything. Hey everyone, Scott here. We're going to take a short break for a word from our sponsors.
The way candidates would campaign by train, it really was set in stone for decades, from the 1920s, even earlier with Teddy Roosevelt. And things really did not change too much. An interesting wrinkle over time was the introduction of technology. When Abraham Lincoln was traveling by train, he had a telegraph machine, which was new for the time. In the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, as new technology was introduced, that was often incorporated on the train, where candidates would take a cameraman, newsreel crews, telephone hookups, public address systems. Just as a new technology was available, it often showed up on the campaign train. In 1976, President Jimmy Carter, running for president, had a copying machine on board, which was kind of new for its time. And Jody Powell, who was the press secretary, he told me years later that he kind of regretted having a copying machine. He thought the equipment would be used to help duplicate copies of Carter's speeches. But the day the campaign train was held, it was the same day that a very controversial interview in Playboy magazine was published, where Carter said he lusted after women in his heart. And there was one copy or so of the interview on the train, and reporters made use of the copying machine to make copies of the interview. And the stories that way was not the train, usually, but it was information about the controversial interview in Playboy magazine. When President Reagan campaigned by train in Ohio in 1984, the technology was much more advanced, and he was actually able to have a conversation with the crew of the space shuttle, which was circling hundreds of miles overhead. So the technology and the evolution of technology helped provide different wrinkles to campaign trains. But in terms of the strategy, the tactics, it's pretty much remained the same over the years. There are pros and cons to campaigning by train, however. On the plus side, it's a great way to connect with people across the country, whether it's small towns and communities or large metropolitan areas. It's a great way to generate publicity and news coverage. It's a great way to help connect with people and to get them excited and to hear and see for themselves a presidential candidate. The con is that you need the obvious things to use a campaign train. You need a serviceable set of train tracks. You need to have the money and resources to hire the train. You need the time to help map out the route and to organize the train and get the right people on board and to publicize the event so people will come out. And people think that use of campaign trains was pretty much limited to the 1930s, 40s, and 50s. But according to my research, there were actually more campaign trains by more candidates in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, and 90s than there were in the earlier part of the century. And it was Joe Biden running for president in 2020 who campaigned by train, very limited, but he used it very effectively to generate press coverage. Whether more candidates in the future are going to be campaigning by train, well, that remains to be seen. But if they regard campaign trains as eye candy to help attract the attention of the public and the media, then I would not be surprised if one or two candidates in the years to come take advantage of trains to help connect with people and to get their views across to the public.
That's very interesting. I wonder why, in some senses, it's become more useful. Train travel has not become more integrated into American life. The small Iowa town I grew up in used to have passenger train travel, but I think it ended in the 50s or 60s. I couldn't even tell you in the town where the depot is located. Now there's a few Amtrak passenger train depots scattered here and there around the United States. But in an earlier age, everyone would know where the train depot was. That was the hub of social life. So when a candidate would roll into town and train, everybody would know where that would be. That's not the case now. But do you think there's a spectacle about this because it does seem to harken back to an earlier form of American life, or maybe because it's exotic that piques people's interest today?
Yeah, I think it's so rare, it's so unusual that I think it's still can be a great news hook. But the other thing that's changed in American society is that many people lived in town, and you're right, they would know where their train stations were. Now with the advent years ago of suburbs, and people are living and working much farther from the city center and train stations than they did before. That certainly would be a negative for any candidate considering using campaign trains. That's why it has to be done carefully and judiciously so it makes sense. Many people these days would probably be against traveling several miles to downtown to see a candidate at a major railroad station. But as Obama did and Biden did in their campaigns, their train trips were not stopping at major cities. It was more smaller communities in Ohio or Pennsylvania. That's why I think it still would be a good thing, a good plus to the advantage of the candidate if they did a campaign train, but do it in the outlying areas of the city, not the major city centers. They're more likely to reach the people they want, more likely to generate the publicity that they want, and more likely to create the excitement they want if they carefully choose when, where, and how they campaign by train.
You mentioned the press earlier, and this is worth focusing on. After all, the subtitle of your book is Campaign Trains and the Reporters Who Covered Them. And how would you describe the relationship between campaigns and the journalists who are covering them on the same train? In a sense, it's a symbiotic relationship between the two camps. Campaigns need media attention on their candidate so people are aware of what they're saying. They want quotes of the candidate, the messaging to go out. Reporters want to have a story, maybe the most idealistic among them, really wear the banner of being the fourth estate proudly. But I study journalism, and it's also mutually parasitic, if we're going to say it the most cynically way possible, that a campaign would want to manipulate the media to get them to say what they want to say. The press is looking for the juiciest, maybe the most humiliating facts that they can, that a campaign desperately doesn't want to get out because they know that can sell newspapers and make a lot of money, make a name for the reporter. So with this mixture of dating / poker match / fencing match between the two camps, what was that like on a train?
Really depended on the candidate. Many times it was collegial, and there was great working relationship between the candidate and the staff. Sometimes a little bit more adversarial and contentious. But my favorite story about reporters and relationships with the candidates was President Harry Truman in 1948, when he had dozens or hundreds of reporters on his train or covering his trip, and he liked to play poker, and he liked to meet with reporters as the train was traveling after the speeches were done for the day. And many of the reporters would give him advice on how well or poorly he did on his speeches. And Truman welcomed the advice, and he would often incorporate their recommendations and suggestions and observations to give better speeches. And some reporters noted that the more advice Truman got from the reporters, the better he got on the campaign trail. You'd never see that relationship today of, say, a correspondent for a major news network or major daily newspaper giving advice to a presidential candidate. It simply would be unheard of. But the life on the campaign trains for reporters could be very, very hectic. Reporters working for wire services were on call almost 24/7, where the candidates would have such a hectic schedule The reporters for the wire services were required to write and document and file stories for every speech the candidate would give. Other reporters working for daily newspapers, they might have had a better, more relaxing time, but they were on call as well. They had their deadlines. They had to go out. They had to scramble outside the car when the train stopped to cover the candidate. But not all the reporters would empty out of the car, the press car, to go listen to the candidate. Sometimes they would just wait for a transcription of the remarks to be distributed to the press, and they would write their stories from that press handout. Sometimes, if the candidate's train staff was well organized, the press would receive advance copies of the remarks, and some reporters didn't even bother to go out of the train. They would just write their story from their prepared remarks. Other reporters would take the advance copy, go out of the train anyway, and just make sure that the candidate was not straying from their prepared remarks. But whether they were adversarial or collegial, generating press coverage and working closely with the reporters, whether it was the staff or the candidates, was an important reason why candidates would campaign by train. A lot of people got a lot of information from that experience, and it was a great way for the candidates to share what they were saying, not just to the people who came out to see them at the train stations, but with audiences of newspapers and radio and television stations across the country as well.
This is an aside, but I wonder, from your experience as a campaign manager, press secretary, and then also studying centuries of history of how these two parties relate with each other, which do you think is healthier for America, whether there's a friendly relationship between politicians and the press or an adversarial relationship? Or perhaps there's just pros and cons to both. I would say now we live in a time of an adversarial relationship, and some might look fondly to friendlier times and talk about, say, when Ronald Reagan was friends with Tip O'Neill, the Democratic Speaker of the House, and that friendship allowed them to put aside bickering wedge issues and look at the big challenges facing America and compromise. Others would say, well, if things get too buddy-buddy and chummy-chummy between estates that are supposed to be adversarial, there's not a check on powers, and this can lead to an oligarchy where it's an old boys club where the press will gladly ignore all the mistresses that a JFK or other people will have, and there's no sunlight to be a disinfectant on the bacterial growth of American politics. So from what you've seen personally, but also historically, do you think it's good if there's an adversarial relationship between the two?
Between the two, collegial and friendly or adversarial, I come down squarely on the side of adversarial. I think we need to put politicians under the harsh glare of press scrutiny. The reporters need to ask the hard and difficult questions in order to help ensure that the American public is getting the information they need. And also, the more adversarial the relationship, it really shows what these politicians are made of. If they're giving evasive answers to straightforward questions, that sends one message. If they're responsive and they answer the questions to the best of their ability and they, deal directly with the question, that sends another message. And I think the more adversarial, the better, because there's simply too much at stake in America today to give politicians a free ride or to not to ask the hard or tough questions. And I think the American public are better served with an adversarial relationship between press and candidates than a buddy-buddy collegial one.
Right. And if you don't face scrutiny, probably some of the most embarrassing missteps are politicians that are so deeply ensconced in a little partisan bunker. Somebody representing bluest San Francisco or reddest rural Kentucky, that the first time they actually get challenged, they can't answer. They're like a flightless bird in New Zealand who has been away from predatorial pressure for so long, they don't even know how to respond. So it's healthy for you as a politician too. Tell me about some of the stories from the mid-20th century that stick out to you, because I think a lot of people could think, well, the train is dying out by the mid-20th century when passenger automobiles take over. But really, in some senses, we're seeing the height of whistle-stop campaigns with Eisenhower, Goldwater, Harry Truman, you mentioned, LBJ made extensive use of train travel. Are there any particular stories from this time period that stick out to you? Scott here. One more break for a word from our sponsors.
Yeah, I was really surprised doing my research how often presidential candidates would let people imitate them on the campaign train trail. These campaign train tours were often so grueling that candidates just needed to take a rest from these very tight schedules. It was Harry Truman, Eisenhower, FDR, and other candidates would either allow or ask their campaign aides to impersonate them, whether it was to give a wave to the crowd as the trains went through the train station, or in case with even earlier candidates who did not know what the candidates looked like, they would have someone who vaguely looked like the candidate come out from the back of the train, wave to the crowd, maybe even say a few words, and the people thought they had seen and heard the presidential candidate when they had seen someone who had actually impersonated them. But other stories that come to mind, Dwight Eisenhower, he campaigned by train for president in 1952, and oftentimes people would gather at the side of the tracks in small towns and communities just hoping for a glance of the candidate waving to them for the train. But sometimes the engineer of the train, unbeknownst to the candidate, would see a large crowd ahead and on their own volition would stop the train at the side of the tracks outside of a small community. And then the candidate was awakened and would groggily go out and talk to the crowd. That's exactly what happened with Dwight Eisenhower in 1952 when he came out in his bathrobe to talk to the crowd. And then his wife, Mamie, would come out in a negligee and hair curlers and talk to the crowd as well. But they just did not want to miss any opportunity, whether it was planned or unscheduled, to talk to people, to answer their questions. And sometimes it would make news just based on the offhanded conversations that they were having. But these are stories that I talk about much more in depth in my book. And it's one of the reasons I wrote the book, to share these dozens and hundreds of stories about this forgotten way of campaigning for president, and hopefully that helping to educate the public and perhaps spur an idea in the minds of a candidate or the staff that maybe they want to try campaigning by train again in the upcoming election.
And that raises the final point. What has been lost by candidates no longer primarily using trains to campaign, and what do you hope can be regained, whether traveling by train or imitating some form of it that could be done on another bit of transportation? Yes, there are still press members that will follow president on, say, Air Force One or other candidates on airplanes, or maybe drive to the destination and speak to the press advisors there. But it's fundamentally different. So what do you think has been lost now that this is over, and what do you hope will be regained?
Well, I think several things have been lost. We've lost the connection where people would actually come out and see the candidates in person. Depending upon the location, the depot, hundreds or sometimes tens of thousands of people would come out to the train station and see the candidates. Sometimes these events were such a big deal that cities and towns would actually close down for the day. The schools would shut down, the shops would close, and give people an opportunity to go out and see and hear the candidate, which was a big deal. And you just don't see that today. The candidates will go to large public venues such as, stadiums or so on. But I remember one moment, and people would pass down these stories generation to generation about the time they saw, or their parents or their grandparents or great-grandparents saw a candidate in person. So we're definitely missing that kind of excitement and that kind of connection. And the other thing I think we're missing is that kind of honesty. Oftentimes the presidential or other candidates, they would give their scripted remarks, but then they would answer questions from the crowd. And those answers were not scripted, and it was an opportunity for the people in the town or community to hear directly from the candidate, to ask questions of the candidate. And we also are missing an opportunity for the kind of visual excitement. There's nothing like a train slowly entering a train station as a great visual to help get the attention of the press and the public, and to build up interest and enthusiasm for what's to come in the next few minutes when the candidate will speak. And a lot of different elements help to make these memorable events, not just this large train, whether it was a steam locomotive or more recently diesel locomotives coming into town, but also the marching bands and cheerleaders would greet the crowd. And you just don't see that today in the kinds of public events. So going forward, I hope politicians and their staff will learn about this forgotten part of American campaign history and perhaps consider including campaign train travels in their future campaigns.
All right. Well, this is a great understanding of a lost age of American politics, but there's no reason it has to go extinct, as you described here. Well, thank you for sharing all this with us. And for listeners who want to check out Edward's book, the name of it is Whistle Stop Politics, Campaign Trains and the Reporters Who Covered Them. Edward, thank you for joining us. All right, that is all for today. If you'd like to see show notes for this episode and all my other episodes, go to parthenonpodcast.com. That's the name of the podcast network that this show is a part of, along with other great history shows like Steve Guerra's Beyond the Big Screen and History of the Papacy, James Early's Key Battles of American History, and other shows as well. If you'd like to support this show, there are two easy ways to do so. The first is to subscribe to History Unplugged on the podcast player of your choice and leave a review. The second thing is to join the show's membership program. It's on Patreon, and if you go to patreon.com/unplugged and join it, as a member, you'll get completely ad-free episodes of the show's entire back catalog, which is 600 episodes and growing. Just go to patreon.com/unplugged. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.